Welcome back to Crime Documentary Files. Today we will explore a case that took place in Indonesia. Our story begins with Zuraidah Hanum, a widowed mother from Aceh. Her life took a significant turn in 2011 when she married Jamaluddin, a judge working at the Negeri Medan court in North Sumatra. Jamaluddin was also a widower with 2 children. After their wedding, they moved into Jamaluddin's house in the upscale Royal Monaco complex in Medan City. Their marriage was marked by the birth of a daughter. In their home lived just 4 people: Jamaluddin, Zuraidah, Zuraidah's child from her previous marriage, and their daughter together. Jamaluddin's 2 children from his previous marriage were already grown and lived elsewhere. One was a doctor, and the other was studying at a university in Jakarta. In the early years of their marriage, Zuraidah was a housewife, dedicated to caring for the children. However, with her new status, she enjoyed considerable privileges. A luxury car with a private driver to handle her daily needs, such as taking the children to school, shopping, and supervising a palm oil plantation business, a venture funded by her husband in North Sumatra. On the surface, their life seemed perfect with financial stability. But behind this facade of happiness were emerging cracks. After just a few years together, their relationship began to show problems, mainly stemming from Zuraidah's greedy nature and controlling attitude. These characteristics gradually made Jamaluddin feel uncomfortable and distant from his own wife. The tension in their marriage pushed Jamaluddin toward extramarital affairs. Somehow, Zuraidah discovered her husband's infidelity. Her response was to hire her private driver to monitor Jamaluddin's movements whenever he left the house. The constant feeling of being watched, combined with Zuraidah's increasingly controlling and possessive attitude, made Jamaluddin feel suffocated. Their marriage became so unbearable that he decided to seek a divorce and hired a lawyer to initiate the process. However, Zuraidah firmly opposed this divorce. As their marital relationship grew more complicated, Zuraidah began confiding in her private driver, the very person she had hired to spy on her husband. These conversations gradually became concerning when Zuraidah went beyond merely complaining about her husband and suggested that the driver participate in a plan to kill Jamaluddin. Shocked by this proposal, the driver immediately refused. Nevertheless, the idea of killing her husband had taken root in Zuraidah's mind, though at this point she hadn't found anyone willing to help execute her dark plan. But in 2018, Zuraidah met and became acquainted with Jeffrey, a failed political candidate. They met at their children's school, as Zuraidah's child and Jeffrey's child attended the same elementary school. Their acquaintance began with casual conversations about their children and eventually progressed to Zuraidah actively sharing her marital conflicts with Jeffrey. This led to a close relationship, and ultimately, Zuraidah began an affair with Jeffrey. After a year of their affair, Zuraidah started planning a serious relationship with Jeffrey, but simultaneously refused her husband's decision to divorce. In November 2019, a few days before her husband intended to divorce her, Zuraidah met Jeffrey at Coffee Town, a cafe in the Ring Road area of Medan. There, she plotted to kill her husband with Jeffrey, promising that if her husband died, she would legally inherit his assets as his wife, provided he died before divorcing her. After her husband's death, Zuraidah planned to marry Jeffrey. With this proposal, Jeffrey, who was willing to do anything for Zuraidah, agreed to her plan to kill Jamaluddin. Jeffrey even suggested his brother, Reza Pahlavi, who he claimed could help them carry out the murder. Reza, who worked as a shop attendant and needed extra money, was brought in. The next day, they met again at Coffee Town, this time with Reza in tow. There, Reza directly asked Zuraidah if she really wanted to kill her husband. Zuraidah assured him that her plan was completely serious. She claimed she was doing this because she couldn't tolerate her husband anymore due to his frequent affairs with numerous women. Zuraidah explained to Reza as if she were the one betrayed by her husband, despite her own infidelity. She promised to pay Reza 100 million rupiah, approximately $6,400, if he helped them. Not only that, but she also promised to send Reza on an Umrah pilgrimage. Tempted by these offers, Reza agreed, and they planned to execute Jamaluddin as soon as possible before he could divorce Zuraidah. Zuraidah provided 2 million rupiah, about $128, to Jeffrey and Reza to purchase the equipment they needed for their plan, including jackets, clothes, shoes, and even mobile phones and SIM cards, which they planned to use only once during the execution to avoid leaving any traceable evidence. The plan was meticulously prepared, and all of it was conceived by Zuraidah. On November 28, 2019, all three were ready and finally carried out their criminal plan. At 6:45 p.m. that day, Zuraidah picked up Jeffrey and Reza at the market. By 7:10 p.m., they arrived at Zuraidah's house while her husband was still at work. Zuraidah smuggled them into the house and hid them on the third floor where the water tank was located. There, they waited for further instructions from Zuraidah, planning to act in the middle of the night. Afterward, Zuraidah went downstairs to prepare dinner for Jamaluddin before he returned from work. Around 8 p.m., Jamaluddin came home, they had dinner, and then relaxed watching TV on the second floor of the house. At this point, everything was proceeding normally with no signs of what was to come. Around 9 p.m., Zuraidah's sister happened to arrive, wanting to stay overnight. Zuraidah's sister often stayed at their house and always slept in the guest room on the first floor. At 10 p.m., Zuraidah took their youngest child to bed in their room as usual, as the youngest child always slept with Zuraidah and Jamaluddin in their room on the second floor. Then at 1 a.m., after her husband and child were fast asleep, Zuraidah signaled to Jeffrey and Reza that it was time to act. They crept down to the second floor and entered Zuraidah's bedroom. Without hesitation, all three, Zuraidah, Jeffrey, and Reza, used a pillow to smother Jamaluddin's face, preventing him from breathing. During these fatal moments, Zuraidah's child woke up, but with frightening calmness, Zuraidah quickly lulled the child back to sleep. Once they were certain Jamaluddin showed no signs of life, Jeffrey and Reza returned to their hiding place on the third floor, planning to be escorted out the next morning when Zuraidah would pretend to discover her husband had died of a heart attack, exactly as they had planned. However, upon examining the body, Zuraidah noticed a bruise on the victim's nose, a sign that could reveal the true cause of death. Panicking, she moved her child to the older child's room, then hurriedly called Reza and Jeffrey back down to the second floor to adjust their plan. After discussion, Zuraidah came up with a new approach, staging the scene to make it appear as though Jamaluddin had died in an accident. At 4 a.m., Zuraidah began changing Jamaluddin's clothes, dressing him in the exercise uniform he typically wore every Friday morning before going to work. By 5 a.m., Jeffrey was driving Jamaluddin's car, the vehicle he used daily to commute to work, while Reza followed on a motorcycle, forming what looked like an escort. Zuraidah stayed at home, acting as the remote commander, giving orders and coordinating the entire operation of her accomplices. According to the plan, they wanted to take Jamaluddin to Berestagi, intending to stage a car accident there. But because the road to Berestagi was heavily congested, Zuraidah finally signaled them to take him to the palm oil plantation area in Kutalimbaru, Deli Serdang, where the roads were quite deserted. They eventually arrived there, and somehow Jeffrey managed to drive the car off the road and into a tree, causing severe damage to the vehicle. But Jeffrey himself was completely unharmed. They placed Jamaluddin's body in the back seat of the car, then left him there as if he had been in a car accident. Meanwhile, Zuraidah remained at home, preparing breakfast for her child and taking them to school as usual. By noon, locals finally discovered Jamaluddin's car in its wrecked state, and they were shocked to find a body inside. The residents reported the incident to the police, who immediately arrived and examined the scene. There, the police instantly felt something was amiss because Jamaluddin's body was in the back seat of the car, indicating someone else had been driving. This was the starting point of the suspicion that led police to believe others were involved in this incident. At the scene, the efforts of the police and local residents focused on evacuating the victim from the severely damaged car and rushing him to Bhayankara Hospital in Medan. Only after completing the identification process did they discover that the victim was Jamaluddin, a judge working at the Nagari Medan court. The police immediately notified the family, including Zuraidah as his wife. Upon receiving the news, Zuraidah rushed to Bhayankara Hospital. There, Zuraidah put on an outstanding performance of grief. She wept bitterly, appearing to be the person most deeply hurt by her husband's sudden death. Zuraidah acting successfully deceived everyone present, making people believe this was a tragic accident. Although in reality, the investigators still had many questions about the true nature of the incident. From the beginning, investigators noticed several irregularities in the case. What made them most suspicious was the position of Jamaluddin's body in the back seat of the car rather than the driver's seat. This raised the obvious question: who was driving? If the driver was also a victim in the accident, why did they disappear from the scene? These inconsistent details prompted the police to broaden their investigation to identify the person who had been driving the vehicle, though at this point they weren't yet suspicious of Zuraidah, the wife who was playing the role of the grieving relative of the victim. During the investigation, Zuraidah was also called in to give her statement. She claimed that that morning, her husband had said goodbye to go exercise as was his routine every Friday morning, and he had also mentioned picking someone up at Kuala Namu Airport, though Zuraidah claimed not to know who he was picking up. She emphasized that she hadn't been suspicious when her husband left the house at such an early hour because this was his usual schedule, morning exercise followed by work. This was Zuraidah's false testimony, which no one knew was fabricated at the time. No one suspected Zuraidah because her acting was truly exceptional. Everyone knew her as the victim's wife, the person most grieved by this case. Many people even consoled Zuraidah, telling her to stay strong after losing her husband. All of her careful planning had covered up her tracks perfectly. Later, the police requested permission from the family to autopsy Jamaluddin's body to determine the cause of death, which was initially refused by Zuraidah. In fact, Zuraidah was the only family member who opposed the autopsy, which made the police slightly suspicious of her. Because of this, the police felt that Jamaluddin's body really needed to be examined as irregularities were beginning to emerge. Finally, the body was autopsied at Bhayangkara Hospital in Medan. After the autopsy, the cause of Jamaluddin's death was discovered, which truly shocked the police. Jamaluddin had died from suffocation. This wasn't suffocation due to an illness like a heart attack. Jamaluddin had no history of heart disease, and his heart was in normal, healthy condition at the time. Rather, Jamaluddin had died because someone had deliberately suffocated him, and here the police knew there must be a perpetrator who had done all this. Moreover, after deeper investigation through forensics, they discovered that Jamaluddin had actually died 9 hours before his car crashed that morning. Finally, police could confirm that Jamaluddin had died in the middle of the night, not that morning due to an accident. At this point, the police began to find Zuraidah's previous testimony suspicious, as she had claimed her husband had said goodbye to go exercise that Friday morning. Because of this, the police finally focused their investigation on the victim's family, especially those who lived in or were present at the house at the time of the incident, including Zuraidah, her sister, and Zuraidah's 2 children. They were all interviewed by the police, who asked when they had last seen Jamaluddin. Of all their testimonies, only Zuraidah claimed that she had last seen her husband when he said goodbye to exercise at 5 a.m. Here, Zuraidah had fallen into a trap, clearly proving that her testimony contradicted the autopsy results. The police became even more suspicious of her, but as Zuraidah seemed to know the police were suspecting her, she created a new alibi out of panic. She claimed that their house was frequently terrorized by unknown individuals who had even rammed into their gate, causing their fence to be damaged multiple times due to these terrorizing acts. But after questioning both children, they testified that their house had never been terrorized, no one had ever crashed into their fence, and there was no damage to the fence. Growing more suspicious, the police checked the CCTV footage of the house and found that the footage from the night of the incident had been deleted. This certainly made the police feel even more suspicious. In summary, the police eventually found this deleted CCTV footage because digitally deleted footage isn't completely erased and can still be accessed. It turned out that in the recycle bin data, it hadn't been completely deleted. From this, the police finally found the CCTV footage from the night of the incident, which clearly showed Zuraidah bringing 2 unknown men into the house, and these 2 men appearing in the CCTV leaving in the early morning, driving Jamaluddin's car, followed by another man on a motorcycle. This was also captured on the neighbor's CCTV. From this CCTV footage, the police became convinced that Zuraidah was the perpetrator. Because of this, Zuraidah was finally arrested by the police, which truly confused the entire family and even shocked all of Indonesia as the case had been reported nationwide. At that time, no one knew the progress of the investigation, and suddenly Zuraidah, the wife known as the most grieved person in this case, was unexpectedly arrested by the police. So everyone was confused. At that time, the police were also investigating and hunting for the two men who appeared in the CCTV. It didn't take long for the police to capture Jeffrey and Reza. From there, Jeffrey and Reza finally confessed everything and revealed all the plans truly conceived by Zuraidah, which shocked all of Indonesia, especially their family after learning that Zuraidah was the mastermind behind her husband's death. Not only that, but the main reason why Zuraidah did all this was also revealed. This came from the testimony of Jamaluddin's lawyer, who disclosed that Jamaluddin had actually filed for divorce from Zuraidah, but she had refused because she didn't want Jamaluddin's assets to be divided among his children. If they divorced, Jamaluddin's assets would be divided, especially to his children. Jamaluddin's total assets amounted to 48 billion rupiah, about $3.1 million. Basically, the reason Zuraidah refused the divorce was that she wanted to inherit all of Jamaluddin's assets without sharing, and at that time, their divorce was supposed to happen on December 1st. That's why Zuraidah hurriedly killed her husband on November 28th before he could divorce her in the coming 3 days. Jeffrey's testimony also admitted that he helped Zuraidah because he had been promised marriage to her and the opportunity to enjoy Jamaluddin's assets together. Isn't that crazy? And there, Jeffrey also admitted that he had been Zuraidah's lover for the past year. Even at trial, Jeffrey admitted that before they carried out all of this, before they executed the plan to kill Jamaluddin, Zuraidah and Jeffrey had been intimate with each other. Finally, because of all this evidence presented at the trial, the judge had to shake his head, unable to believe all that Zuraidah had done, especially with her elaborate planning, all of which truly came from her own mind. The judge even considered that Zuraidah no longer deserved to live because what she had done was truly inhumane. Finally, the judge imposed the heaviest sentence on Zuraidah, who was considered the mastermind in this case, sentencing her to death. This was Zuraidah's reaction after the judge sentenced her to death. I am quite disappointed with this court. They look at his position without considering my instincts as a woman, even though they were also born from a woman's womb, but they cannot have a bit of compassion. As if I'm the most guilty person here, as if I did this without any reason. Even at this point, she still felt she was right. Isn't that insane? But in my opinion, this person is truly very dangerous because, as you can see, she remained disturbingly calm throughout. As for Jeffrey and Reza, of course, both were also sentenced, but their sentences were much lighter. Jeffrey was sentenced to life imprisonment, while Reza was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The protagonist of our second case is Nelly, wife of Khairul and mother of 3 children. Nelly was a hard-working wife who successfully established her own Padang restaurant in Karawang, building it entirely through her own efforts and labor. Meanwhile, her husband Khairul took no part whatsoever in helping develop his wife's restaurant. In fact, Khairul had no job at all. His daily activities consisted of merely gossiping with locals, while his livelihood completely depended on his wife's restaurant business. He never offered any assistance to Nelly with the restaurant work. Initially, Nelly didn't mind much. The restaurant was thriving, providing the family with a comfortable life, and she was capable of managing everything herself. However, behind this peaceful facade, Khairul constantly demanded money from Nelly for his personal expenses and even helped himself to cash from the restaurant's register without informing his wife. A shocking truth gradually came to light. Khairul was using this money to pursue and maintain extramarital relationships. From 2011, when Nelly restaurant began to achieve success, Khairul developed a habit of taking new wives. When Nelly discovered that her husband had secretly married another woman, they had fierce arguments. But with his apologies and promises, Nelly forgave him. Unfortunately, her tolerance did nothing to change Khairul's behavior. He continued down the same path, showing no remorse or shame. By 2021, he had entered into 4 secret marriages, all financed with money from Nelly restaurant. The situation worsened when the children grew up and became aware of their father's wrongdoings. Despite the children's attempts to intervene, even pleading with Khairul to abandon his philandering ways, this man's reaction was not one of shame or remorse. Instead, he responded with rage, yelling at his children and unhesitatingly treating both them and his wife harshly whenever reminded of his family responsibilities. So he was unable to earn money, was unfaithful, and abusive. Because of this, Nelly Wadi initially planned to file for divorce, as she truly couldn't bear it anymore. Moreover, she thought her husband was completely useless, serving no purpose except causing harm. But the divorce petition was ultimately canceled because Nelly Wadi still had reservations and was concerned about the children if they divorced. After all, children need a complete family. Additionally, Nelly Wadi didn't want the assets and restaurant business she had built alone over many years to be divided with Khairul if they divorced. However, not divorcing didn't mean Nelly Wadi had forgiven her husband, as since 2011, she had been betrayed 4 times by his secret marriages to other women. By this point, Nelly Wadi was so angry that she began planning to kill her husband. It all started in March 2021, when Nelly Wadi frequently confided in a familiar rideshare driver at her restaurant named Agus Marzucchini, nicknamed Otong. She shared how her husband had married 4 women using money from her restaurant and regularly took large sums from the restaurant without her knowledge. She then conceived a plan to use black magic to kill her husband and asked Otong to help find a practitioner. Otong agreed, and Nelly Wadi immediately gave him 5 million rupiah, about $320, to pay the sorcerer. In short, after Otong found and paid the sorcerer, they waited to see the effects of the black magic. But after 2 months of waiting, Khairul remained unaffected, showing absolutely no reaction. Finally, Nelly Wadi devised a plan to hire someone who could directly kill her husband. Otong suggested an acquaintance named Iskandar who could handle the job. Eventually, Otong brought Iskandar to the restaurant to introduce him to Nelly Wadi. There, Nelly Wadi agreed and immediately offered to pay 30 million rupiah, about $1,920, if Iskandar could do the deed. She immediately paid a deposit of 10 million rupiah, about $640, and promised to pay the remainder once everything was completed. But initially, Iskandar was hesitant because he also had a family to support, so he feared what would happen if he was caught, arrested, and imprisoned. Nelly Wadi continued persuading Iskandar to the point where she wrote a handwritten agreement promising to provide monthly support for Iskandar's family if he was caught and sent to prison. With this agreement, Iskandar finally accepted the mission to kill Nelly Wadi's husband. They quickly devised a plan where they would make it appear that Khairul was a victim of a robbery, with the help of several people including Otong. Otong's task was to monitor all of Khairul's movements, such as when he left the house, where he went, and when he returned home. In essence, they were looking for vulnerabilities and the most appropriate time to carry out the murder. According to them, this method was easiest because Khairul loved playing tennis and frequently visited the Panadayuda Sports Center, usually returning home in the middle of the night. But just as everyone began performing their tasks, some monitoring and seeking opportunities to carry out the murder, Iskandar suddenly disappeared, fleeing with the 10 million rupiah deposit. So, whether they liked it or not, their initial plan had failed. But Nelly Wadi didn't give up. She asked Otong to find a way to continue the mission. Then in September 2021, Otong finally introduced 5 people to Nelly Wadi who could help execute the plan to kill her husband. Nelly Wadi promised to pay them all 30 million rupiah, but would only pay after everything was successfully completed. Attracted by the generous payment, the group immediately agreed and quickly began detailed planning. They decided to stick with the original strategy, disguising themselves as robbers targeting Khairul when he returned home late at night. According to the assignment, Otong would play the lead role in the attack, supported by 5 accomplices. After many days of surveillance and waiting for the right moment, they decided to strike on September 27th, 2021. Just after dusk, Otong went alone to a cafe near the sports center, where Khairul often chatted with friends. Here, He quietly monitored the target's every move, ready to signal when Khairul was preparing to head home. According to plan, the other 5 accomplices were already waiting at a convenience store along Khairul's usual route. They had been in position since 8 p.m., patiently awaiting Otong's signal. After 3 hours of waiting, at 11 p.m., Khairul was reported to be on his way home, and Otong immediately began following him alone from behind. When Khairul passed the convenience store where they were waiting, they all began to follow him one by one. Here, all 6 of them on 3 motorcycles, including Otong, continued tracking Khairul, waiting for the streets to become completely deserted. But midway, Khairul realized they were following him, especially since the streets were quite empty at that time. Because of this, Khairul became frightened and immediately accelerated. They all immediately tried to chase him. Right in front of Khairul's house, they successfully closed in on his motorcycle and immediately slashed him multiple times. Khairul fell instantly. At that moment, they also stabbed him in the waist and slashed his head until Khairul lay collapsed, bleeding in the middle of the road, right in front of his own house. After that, they left Khairul there. From inside the house, Khairul's daughter named Riska heard the sound of a motorcycle falling, motorcycle engines revving, and noise, very loud sounds. Because of this, she tried to wake up Nelly Wadi, who was sleeping, but Nelly Wadi didn't respond, pretending to be in deep sleep, although that wasn't actually the case. Initially, only Riska tried to look outside, and she was shocked to see her father collapsed in the middle of the road. Desperate, Riska screamed for her mother to wake up, but Nelly Wadi still refused to move. With no other choice, the girl was forced to call relatives and seek help from restaurant staff who lived nearby. Only when many people gathered, including some locals who came to help, did Nelly Wadi slowly emerge from the house with a perfectly staged, sleepy expression. She performed a scene of horror when she saw her husband lying motionless in the middle of the road in a grievously injured state. People rushed to provide first aid to Khairul, who still showed faint signs of breathing despite his body being covered with deep stab wounds to his abdomen, waist, and even head. He was urgently transferred to the Karawang Regional Hospital, but by the next day, September 28th, he succumbed to his severe injuries. At that time, everyone believed Khairul was an unfortunate victim of a brutal robbery. But after the police took over the case and began investigating, they felt something was amiss. This didn't seem to be a robbery because the purpose of a robbery is to steal the victim's valuables, perhaps like a motorcycle. But strangely, none of the victim's possessions were missing. The police began to be suspicious, even believing there might be other motives or purposes behind the perpetrator's actions. At that time, the police continued their investigation in the area where the incident occurred. Meanwhile, Khairul was immediately buried. 5 days after her husband's burial, Nelly Wadi met with Otong at Ramayana Karawang. There, Nelly Wadi gave 10 million rupiah payment to Otong, with the remaining 20 million planned to be paid the following month. And Nelly Wadi also asked Otong not to contact her until the situation was truly safe to avoid arousing suspicion. It turned out that, at that time, Nelly Wadi's actions when meeting Otong at Ramayana were under police surveillance because the police were secretly investigating the family, especially Nelly Wadi as the wife. The case had many irregularities according to the police, prompting them to investigate the family's relationships. As a result, the police had information about arguments between Nelly Wadi and her husband over his infidelity issues. Because of this, the police finally suspected Nelly Wadi and eventually monitored all her movements wherever she went. But she wasn't immediately arrested. The investigators there were still waiting, watching until the evidence was truly clear and trying to gather information about the man Nelly Wadi met at Ramayana, Otong. In summary, the police finally found information about Otong, the man whom Nelly Wadi secretly met, and eventually approached him for questioning about the purpose of meeting Nelly Wadi at Ramayana. After the interrogation, Otong finally couldn't withstand the pressure and had no choice but to admit his involvement in the case, even confessing that he was one of the people who executed Khairul. Otong also admitted that not only was he involved, but there were 5 other perpetrators, the 5 friends who had helped him. Even here, Otong admitted they all did this because they were paid by Nelly Wadi to kill her husband. Finally, because of this, Nelly Wadi was arrested while busy working at her restaurant. Since lies couldn't be hidden during interrogation, Nelly finally admitted everything. She also confessed that she did all this because she truly couldn't tolerate her husband's womanizing and multiple marriages anymore. He had married 4 other women since 2011, using money that Nelly had earned. Nelly also admitted that she truly had no other choice but to do this because her husband was also cruel and abusive, even to their children. This testimony was confirmed by her children and even acknowledged by Khairul's family, who admitted that Khairul was indeed such a person. It turned out that Khairul often proudly introduced his mistresses to his family. Khairul even introduced his lovers to the neighborhood chief where he lived, boasting about his affairs openly and proudly, betraying his wife, hurting and causing damage to the woman who had worked hard for decades to support their family. A task that should have been the husband's responsibility as the family's pillar. Because of this, everyone truly felt that Nelly was quite pitiful, especially her children, who knew the cruelty and brutality their father had inflicted on their mother. Perhaps she did this feeling it was the only way to protect herself and her children, but regardless, Nelly had committed a crime. For this reason, she, Otong, and the 5 other perpetrators who had been arrested were all put on trial. At that time, all parties, Nelly children, the entire family, including Khairul's family, had forgiven Nelly. They even requested the judge to reduce her sentence. In the end, they were all sentenced to 13 years in prison, which was actually quite a light sentence for a premeditated murder carried out collectively. Perhaps this was because the motive was self-defense from what the victim had done, and also because the victim's family pitied Nelly, had forgiven her, and asked the judge for a lighter sentence. So perhaps the judge was also sympathetic and delivered the fairest possible sentence. These heartbreaking cases serve as a profound warning about the tragic consequences when marital relationships deteriorate to the point of no return. Both stories about Zuraidah and Nelly reveal the fragile boundary between love and hate, between rationality and extreme emotions. Although the cases have concluded, their repercussions continue to affect the children and families involved, the invisible victims who suffer the deepest wounds from these tragedies. And those are our 2 cases for today. What do you think about these 2 cases? Please share in the comments section below. Thank you for watching and see you in the next videos.